You know how sometimes you go down the rabbit hole and come out the other side completely different and your mind is boggled and blown? That is exactly what happened to me when I obsessively studied the witch wound. What I learned honestly shocked me, but kind of was like no surprise. In this video, I share the 20 biggest things I discovered and how it still affects us today. I'll also give you some simple ways people are healing from it. So if you've ever wondered why certain women were feared, or maybe why you sometimes feel nervous about expressing your spiritual gifts or your true self or even your interests, this is for you. What I didn't expect was just how much power, politics, and fear were mixed into all of it. And it wasn't about just herbs and dark magic. It was often about control and just really paranoid men. All 20 discoveries are time-stamped in this video for easy reference, and I have a lot to unpack, so let's get into it. It's not just about women with spiritual gifts and interests. The witch wound is a collective scar, inherited fear and shame for being seen, using nature to heal, or practicing anything spiritual outside of a faith circle or holy book. It explains why so many people will still silence themselves today and feel like they can't share things that they're into that are completely harmless. Think about hiding your interests, downplaying your gifts, being scared to admit that you love crystals and tarot cards and yoga, and going along with things that you actually aren't aligned with just to keep everyone else happy. That's the witch wound in real time. It makes people shrink to avoid judgment or being ousted. In early cultures, healers, midwives, and herbalists were respected. They were the wise ones. But over time, with the rise of Christianity, that same knowledge was reframed as dangerous, and suddenly wisdom was called witchcraft and seen as evil. We can thank King James I of England for that. He's the man who was obsessed with the occult and wrote the book in 1597 called Demonology, which justified the persecution of the witch hunts. He decided in 1604 that he wanted to commission a Bible. So he added Exodus 22:18 into it, which says, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," knowing what it would do to a lot of women in spiritual practices. In 1611, that book got published, and women like me have been made out to be someone we're not, never were. One of the most shocking things that I learned was about this book called, I don't even know how to pronounce it, but it's like Malleus Maleficarum. It was basically a handbook for hunting witches written in the 1400s by two clergymen. Imagine a whole manual telling people how to identify, interrogate, and punish so-called witches. It was filled with superstition, misogyny, and fear, but it carried enormous influence around Europe. Courts actually used it to justify torture and executions. The book described women as naturally weak and more easily corrupted by the devil, which set the tone for centuries of suspicion. It was less about truth and more about control, but people treated it as fact. This showed me how something written by a couple of men could change the lives of thousands, maybe millions. And it's a reminder of how dangerous unchecked ideas can be when they're institutionalized. Another thing that stood out is that the vast majority of those accused of witchcraft were women, and not just any woman, often widows, midwives, and those who lived a little differently. Women with herbal knowledge, birth knowledge, or even women who spoke too freely were often labeled suspicious. At a time when women already had few rights, an accusation of witchcraft was an easy way to silence them. It wasn't only about fear of magic, it was fear of women's independence and power. Misogyny played a central role in who was targeted. Even the word witch itself was gendered. It became shorthand for dangerous women. Men were accused too, but the cultural obsession was with women. And this made me realize that the witch wound is not just spiritual, it's also deeply feminist at its roots. One detail that people forget is that witch trials weren't just about religion or fear, they were also about money. If someone was accused of witchcraft, their property could be seized by the state or by neighbors. Widows who owned land or single women with property were particularly vulnerable. There are records of wealthy women suddenly being accused right after their husbands died. And isn't it interesting that once they were gone, men suddenly owned what used to belong to those women? Greed disguised itself as morality. So it wasn't just about superstition, it was about economics and power. Witch hunts also served religious and political agendas. Leaders realized that fear could unite people under their authority. By pointing to witches as the enemy, they could rally communities together. It was a way to eliminate dissent or alternative spiritual practices that threatened the church's control. It also created loyalty. If your priest or ruler was protecting you from witches, you were more likely to obey them. Fear is one of the oldest political tools, and witchcraft became the perfect scapegoat. It wasn't really about spells or curses, it was about power structures. And that's a piece of the witch wound, realizing your ancestors weren't only punished for who they were, but also used as pawns in a bigger power game. That blew my mind and pissed me off a little bit. One pattern historians noticed is that the witch hunts spiked during crisis. When there was famine, plague, war, the accusations went up. People needed someone to blame when the crops failed or there was a drought or disease spread. Instead of looking at weather or hygiene, they pointed at the women down the road who made herbal remedies. Superstition gave people a sense of control. If we punish the witch, maybe the problem will go away. Communities turned on their own in moments of fear. This scapegoating created paranoia and destroyed trust. What shocked me the most was how predictable it was. And in some ways, humans still do this today. When life feels like it's out of control, we look for an enemy, even if it's innocent people. The witch wound isn't just European. When colonizers spread across the globe, they often labeled indigenous healers and shamans as witches. Their spiritual practices were outlawed, their healing knowledge dismissed as dangerous. In some places, people were forced to abandon traditions that had been practiced for centuries. Calling someone a witch was a way to delegitimize entire cultures. It wasn't about truth, it was about control and erasure. Many indigenous medicines and rituals disappeared or at least went underground because of this. And even today, some people feel shame around practices their ancestors considered sacred. And that's part of the witch wound too. Cultural practices being erased in the name of dominance. To me, that made the witch wound feel global, not just European. Even if none of your direct ancestors were accused of witchcraft, you can still carry the witch wound. Trauma doesn't just stop with the people who experience it. It gets passed down through stories, family behaviors, even in how our nervous systems adapt. If your great-grandmother was told, "Don't stand out," that message may have been passed to your grandmother, your mother, and then you. Psychologists even talk about epigenetics, where trauma responses can show up in DNA expression. That blew me away. The fear of visibility, of being punished for gifts, can be inherited, which means that many of us are carrying wounds we didn't even understand. It explains so much about why we sometimes silence ourselves without knowing why, or why we carry this fear or worry or shame of being ousted when we don't actually have that real world experience of those things happening. Not all witch hunts were in courts. Sometimes it started with whispers. A neighbor gossiped, and suddenly your reputation was ruined. Gossip was a powerful weapon in small communities. It could isolate someone, make them vulnerable, and sometimes it led to formal accusations. Even if you weren't put on trial, the shame could be devastating. That's a form of social control we still see today. Fear of what people will say keeps us quiet. And that's why the witch wound feels familiar. It's not just about witches from history, it's about how humans use shame and gossip to control behavior. The fear of being talked about can be just as powerful as the fear of punishment. What struck me is that the witch wound isn't just personal, it's cultural. It's built into our systems, our stories, our religions. That's why it is so deep. It's not about one person being harmed, it's about centuries of messaging that spirituality, independence, or femininity is dangerous. Healing the witch wound means recognizing it's bigger than us. It's a cultural scar we inherited. And because it's cultural, it shows up in laws, traditions, and even family rules. And that helped me understand why healing feels so big and sometimes overwhelming, because it's not just your trauma, it's generations of trauma. Witch hunts were also about controlling women's bodies. Women who enjoyed sexual freedom or who knew about birth control or reproductive health were suspicious. Patriarchy needed women to be controlled, and labeling them witches was the way to do it. Female pleasure, fertility, and independence all became a threat to the system. That control over sexuality wasn't about safety, it was about power. Even today, you can see echoes of it in debates about reproductive rights and the purity culture. That's why the witch wound still feels relevant. It's not ancient history, it's the same dynamics of controlling women's agency dressed in modern clothes. And that shocked me how little has changed. As official medicine rose, mostly run by men, folk healers were pushed aside. Herbal remedies, midwifery, and intuitive practices were branded dangerous and unscientific. What we lost was centuries of plant medicine and holistic healing. Imagine how much knowledge about herbs and natural remedies disappeared because women were silenced. One of the most relatable things is how the witch wound shows up in modern life. Ever stop yourself from posting a piece of art or speaking in a meeting because you're afraid of judgment? That's the witch wound echoing. The fear of standing out comes from generations of punishment for visibility. Even when no one's chasing us with torches, our nervous systems react like they might. It's why imposter syndrome is so common. Creativity feels risky when your ancestors were punished for it. If you grew up in a religious household, you probably know this feeling. Anything outside of a church or a book is labeled evil. Crystals, astrology, meditation, yoga, that's bad in some circles. That voice in your head saying that you'll be punished for this isn't always yours. It's inherited from centuries of conditioning. That's part of the witch wound, the internalized voice that tells you that curiosity is dangerous. It's heartbreaking, honestly, because many of those practices bring peace and healing. For centuries, they were demonized. Healing this means separating your inner truth from the fear-based teachings, and that takes courage. What I love is that people are reclaiming the word witch today. Instead of it meaning evil, it's being embraced as healer, intuitive, creator. Rituals, books, and communities are reviving practices that were once feared. It's about saying, we're not ashamed anymore. Reclaiming the word is like reclaiming your power. It's an act of resistance, but also very, very healing. Some people don't resonate with the word, and that is okay. But for many, saying witch proudly is a way to break the cycle of fear. Not everyone was equally vulnerable. Class, race, and disability often shaped who was accused. Poor women, women of color, and socially marginalized people were easy targets. They didn't have protection or resources to defend themselves. So witch hunts weren't just about gender, they were about multiple layers of oppression. Seeing it through an intersectional lens makes it even clearer. The witch wound is tied to broader injustices. Healing it means acknowledging all of those layers, and that gave me more compassion for how complex this history really is. So how do we actually heal this? It's not just therapy, and it's not just rituals, it's both. Therapy and tools like CBT help reframe limiting beliefs. Rituals help you embody new truths and you feel it in your bones. Blending psychology and spirituality makes healing more complete. It's about calming your nervous system so you feel safe to be seen. It's also creating rituals that let you claim visibility and power. Community helps too. Practicing being authentic around safe people builds confidence. Healing is layered, but it's possible. You'll know that you're healing when you start to feel safe sharing who you are. when you no longer apologize for your interests or gifts, when posting online doesn't feel terrifying. You carry yourself differently, your shoulders are back, your voice is steady. You feel peace about your spiritual practices, even if others don't get it. You start trusting yourself more than external approval. Relationships feel more authentic because you're showing up honestly. Creativity flows because you're not holding back. That's what freedom from the witch wound looks like. So those are the 20 biggest things I learned about the witch wound, and honestly, I barely scratched the surface. I shared a bunch of links in the description area where you can go and do your own research and come up with your own conclusions and perspective on this topic. What shocked me most is that it was never just about spiritual practices and the use of herbs. It was about power, politics, paranoia, paranoid kings, fear, and control. But the good news is that healing the witch wound is easier than you know. It's about reclaiming your right to exist, to speak, and to share your spiritual beliefs, gifts, and interests with those in your life. If this resonated, hit subscribe, because over the next few months, I'm going to be diving exclusively into the witch wound in hopes to help you heal from it for good. And if you're feeling the pull to start healing yours, I will share my witch wound ebook and course down below in the description area. And let me know in the comments which of these 20 points, or anything that I said really, was the most shocking to you. All right, be sure to like and subscribe. I will see you on the next video. Bye.